My background's actually marine. I have a degree in oceanography, and I teach marine biology, or I would be pretty soon if I weren't on sabbatical. So I've had to learn freshwater myself. And when I first got my job at Minnesota, I had to figure out where it was, and was horrified to see how far it was from the ocean and all the marine fish that I love and everything. But you know what? I think freshwater is a pretty cool area to work, and I've actually become really fascinated by it. And I hope I can kind of introduce that perspective to you. There's lots of opportunity there. So I'm a little biased, but I actually am not, because like I said, my background's marine. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the nature of freshwater first. I know you don't think about it very much. Freshwater fisheries, North America, a story that I told here a few months ago about carp in some lakes, and then pass forward to look at it. And this is a picture you see all the time, I'm sure. You know, the world is pretty blue, but if you look even closer, my point is, in very fine resolution, you'll see that there's a lot of really interesting water on the continents, and it might even be argued that, and I'll tell you, that this water is greatly undervalued and appreciated, and much more interesting in its fisheries than you might think. And I've never actually been there, the Great Bear Lake wanted to go. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of the water heart in Great Bear Lake, just to your north, but the people who live there believe that's the source of all life, and actually will be where it all retreats to if we don't reverse our direction. It's an interesting story. They believe there's a water heart in the middle of that huge lake from which all life appeared and may come back. So first off, if you're not familiar with ichthyology, or maybe you took it some time ago, you might, just reminding you that over 40% of all species of fishes actually are freshwater. And I've marked the ones up there that, and that tells you something about the variety of habitats in freshwater. And some of these fish you might think well, they're fairly recent, but that's not true at all. In the Mississippi River where I work, we have lots of cartilaginous fishes that are very fascinating and underappreciated. We have paddlefish, sturgeon, lampreys, all these relics from hundreds of millions of years ago. So there's quite a variety, even in continental waters. And I find that really interesting. Not as many as a coral reef, but still taxonomically an equal breadth of fishes in fresh as in salt water. And if you look at world fisheries production, especially if you include aquaculture, which is largely freshwater, and I apologize, some of you would much better. I don't even quite, that's one reason I'm here, is to figure out, frankly, how valuable these data are and what they really mean. But if you just pull off FAO data off Wikipedia, you'll see that, and you add the freshwater portion that's thought to reflect aquaculture with actual freshwater wild fisheries, you'll see that almost half world fisheries production, approximately, I mean nobody really knows, right, that's the issue, is freshwater. And that this production, if you look at it really carefully, at best it's static, it might be falling, and this is in spite of huge amounts of perturbations in freshwater. There's, for instance, issues that you don't face, at least in a direct fashion, in marine systems, with stocking, for instance, and increasing fishing efforts. Everything that happens in marine systems is much more complex, and I would argue maybe more complicated in freshwater, believe it or not. I'll show you some examples, and greatly underappreciated. And I'm not trying to convert anybody from studying marine systems, but there are lots of really interesting opportunities in freshwater. I've been, 30 years now I've been at Minnesota, and it hasn't been boring at all, not in the least. It is an infinite variety of things to look at. And when you look across the world, there's a whole series of fisheries collapses that are occurring, particularly in large lakes, just as there are in the oceans. These just don't seem to get the news that I think basically because they're not associated with large commercial industries, but I'll tell you in a second here, this is associated both with large recreational fisheries, which are of great value economically, and also it's sort of two ends of the spectrum, interestingly, I think. I think that might be the story. The very poor and the very rich both rely pretty heavily or use freshwater fishes in particular. And this is a figure from a recent publication by McIntyre looking at freshwater fisheries focused on river fisheries. And what Pete McIntyre found was that as the world's poorest of the poor, people in Africa and Asia, maybe there's a pointer here, but if you look at the blue line, this is the bottom is annual income, per capita income, and the y-axis is percentage of those people that rely, most importantly, mostly on freshwater fisheries. And it's the poorest of the poor that rely on these river fisheries, and which, until he presented this paper, Proceedings from the National Academy of Sciences a couple years ago, was pretty underappreciated. Only when you get wealthier can you start to afford marine fisheries, apparently, and aquaculture. And these are people that are living largely on large river systems and eating fish in a sustenance way. So it's really actually pretty important to about a couple 100 million people. That's almost 100% of their diet. And then additionally, the other end of the spectrum, those of us fortunate enough to make home in North America, for instance, and I don't have these numbers from Canada, but when you look at the U.S., the last time a survey was done, which was 10 years ago, and you look at, which of course freshwater fisheries are mostly recreational, although there are some commercial fisheries. When you look at these numbers, you'll see that the vast majority of recreational fishing actually is freshwater and not marine, and the value is in the tens of billions of dollars. It's huge. So looking at the numbers here, about 3/4, and I suspect the numbers are pretty similar in Canada, frankly, about 3/4 of all recreational fishers are actually focused on freshwater and not marine, spending somewhere like $2,000 a year on their gear and their boats and so forth, and hotels. This is incredibly important in the middle of North America, including the area I'm from. Almost 50% of all people live in Minnesota, and I suspect it's true in Ontario, fish and have fishing licenses and spend money on it. I'll tell you a little bit more about it. So hopefully I've at least impressed you that half the world's fish come from freshwater, live there. An awful lot of people depend upon it in ways that is sorely underappreciated for food, and then a lot of people just enjoy fishing and spend a lot of money on it. So it's a big, important thing. And yet, when you look at it, only, and this number, I had to check it a couple times, only 0.02% of the world's liquid water is fresh. So you have an incredible concentration of effort in just a tiny, tiny piece of the aquatic environment. So this is a pretty extraordinary situation. I would argue that fresh water is, however liter per liter is much more valuable from a fisheries perspective, liter per liter, than a marine system. And that's kind of where I'm coming from. And what's so special about these freshwater systems? When I first moved actually from Alberta to Minnesota, I thought, well, just these streams flowing, and what can be so interesting about that? But actually, freshwaters are much more. I've had to learn it the hard way, usually. I guess that's. And there are some really unique things about freshwater that are very important to understand. A, they're quite shallow. This means they're easily warmed if you're concerned with climate change and pollution and acidification. Of course, fresh water is going to be much more, this 0.02% is going to be hammered. And that's really important to a lot of people, and the environment. They're intimately associated with the landscape and watersheds. This is not the case in marine systems. So you have watersheds that might be 10, 20 times the volume of the water that drain into these systems, so everything gets concentrated. This leads to very high productive levels of productivity and nutrients in general in fresh waters. This is how it can support hundreds of millions of people fishing in lakes and rivers and things like that. They're highly interconnected. They exist often in alternative stable states. I thought estuaries were interesting in how dynamic they are and how the salt changes in estuaries. It's nothing compared to a temperate lake. Every year, the entire temperate lake turns over, bottom to top, because the water cools and then it flips. So there's total mixing in these environments. So it's really dynamic and interesting. And rivers, of course, it's a whole different dynamic there. By comparison, frankly, a lot of oceanic systems are pretty stable and simple compared to what's going on. Much more going on in freshwater than you might imagine intuitively. Most freshwater systems are quite young geologically because of glaciation, so they're relatively simple. This means that you have dramatic impacts. They're not like, it's the opposite of let's say a coral reef where you have great complexity and stability. A freshwater system, you might only have a few dozen species, which leads to incredible dynamism, really different. You know, it's a whole set of rules going on there that are very poorly understood, but you know, lots of interesting opportunities. And then I just wanted to point out that we have lakes. There are lakes, rivers, reservoirs, and wetlands, and each one of those has different nutrient cycles, temperature cycles, different sorts of flow regimes and species in them. So there's an awful lot of diversity that's really underappreciated in freshwater. It really is. So hopefully I've convinced you. I trying all the time. I mean, honestly, even at Minnesota, 3 out of 4 students are more interested in the oceans than they are in fresh water and in their own home. And you know, but there's a lot once you look under the water surface. Freshwater and its fisheries are incredibly interesting and complex. They're just giving you a little, they're quite different than marine systems in many basic ways. They're exceptionally valuable, and I'm going to argue they're very poorly understood. We don't really understand how large lakes work. You understand coral reefs much better than we understand how lake systems work, honestly, or large rivers. It's absolutely true. And they're exceptionally threatened for kind of the reasons I went through. Just go through quickly. They're young, so they're simple. So aquatic invasive species are just ripping through freshwater systems now in a way that you don't see in marine systems. There's no biotic resistance. Everything's interconnected. It's shallow. Climate change is a much bigger issue in freshwater than it is in marine systems, or seems to be. It hasn't received nearly the attention. Highly interconnected, intimately associated with land, so when you have development and people living in places and draining into it, it changes things in ways that are, you know, really dramatic. Everything draining these tiny pools of water that are connected with the sediments. And of course, out here, the big issue is diversion and blocking of connections so that the river fisheries are no longer functioning the same way as salmonids come up. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Minnesota, where I'm from, what's driving me to this, and because I guess I sort of came to the conclusion, I don't really feel, honestly, that I'm much of a freshwater biologist. I'm a marine guy that kind of got stuck in freshwater, but I come to appreciate it more all the time. So Minnesota, if you don't know, is pretty much dead center, just south of Ontario, along the Great Lakes. Glaciated area, was glaciated to about 10,000 years ago. So everything's pretty young. All the ecosystems are young and highly interconnected from the glacial till. And that's what you see there, a very complex system, interconnected waterways, all draining. We go out to actually Hudson's Bay, the Great Lakes, and Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. And we even get marine species in Minnesota, believe it or not, coming all the way up from Mississippi. We have eels and things like that. It's amazing. So this is incredible variety. There are one population of 5 million, 1.4 fishers. So that's about 1 out of 3 people fish, several tribal fisheries. The fishery's worth about $2 billion. And that's the situation with Minnesota. But isn't it amazing how that's all interconnected, different ecosystems and so forth? That's, and I can tell you different prairies, and up north there's hardwood forests, and it's really, each lake is different than the other. It's like its own little ocean, frankly. Each one changing with time of year and inputs. And 40% of these waters, shockingly, are now impaired. Even though the state of Minnesota is spending a fortune, it's a pretty considered progressive state, about $100 million a year, 40% of those lakes and rivers are impaired in some way, with about a quarter of those being excessive nutrient drainage. So that's going to have big impacts. Again, more than you would see typically. Of course, a lot of coastal waters are pretty impacted too, but not like this. It's not understood. And naturally, the fisheries seem to be struggling. We don't have very good data, but here's an example of Mille Lacs. Actually, some of this data was used by Tony Pitcher here. The walleye, which is a large perkid that's quite popular in, it's a North American perkid, although it's related to sauger in Europe. Perciformes, like most oceanic fishes, same group. Anyway, its numbers seem to be collapsing. The same thing, and there was actually a moratorium put on this 100,000-acre lake, which is shallow. It's only about 10 meters deep, so every winter everything flips over. It's extremely complicated and dynamic how lakes work. I had no idea. Very interesting. And same thing in Canada. This is some data from Post just showing that walleye fisheries, the further you get from city center, I think this was Vancouver, the bottom right there, you can see that the catch per unit effort basically doubled. This was 10 years ago. The data from freshwater, frankly, this is one of the reasons I'm here, seem to be even more sparse than from marine systems. The FAO collection, we have different types of fisheries, like I said, the lakes, the rivers, people don't distinguish. There aren't large industrial fisheries, not much of them left anymore in freshwater, so from what I can tell, the data are really pretty awful. And it's just kind of trying to figure this out. And then the other issue in Minnesota, but this is, I'm pretty sure, I know it's true in Ontario, Quebec, invasive species are just ripping through these systems. So this is the number of infested water bodies for zebra mussel on the left. You can see it's going up exponentially. And I don't think these have been found in British Columbia yet, but it's just, I'm sorry to say, a matter of time. These are small dracinid mussel from shallow seas. Actually, a lot of these species are from shallow saline seas. They are just ripping through these systems. And when they're such simple systems with so few things and they're so dynamic, when you have large mats of, for instance, plants, macroalgae there on the right, the Eurasian milfoil that basically shade everything, the effects are extraordinarily severe. And likewise, zebra mussel can filter, well, like they're basically a marine species, can filter a liter a day. So their whole lakes, like that Mille Lacs, I'll show you that next. Basically, that entire lake is filtered by zebra mussels. There are 2 trillion in there, and they filter that entire lake every 24 hours, removing all zooplankton. So this is a really fascinating ecological scenario, and this has just happened in the last few years. And what does that do to the food web and the fisheries? And well, it seems to be correlated with collapses, and there's somebody from this group here, I've never met him, Kumar, actually modeled it, and you can see the inverse relationship between zebra mussels and walleye, and they basically got it right. So I think you can see there's a lot of really dynamic, and how these zebra mussels fit, they're new species in the system, how they fit in, what they're doing. In a system we hardly understand anyway, is really, it's quite extraordinary. Again, my background is marine, and I can tell you that we understand less about zooplankton food webs, based planktonic food webs in lakes than we do probably in most estuaries. No one paid much attention to them, but there's real problems now, so people are starting to, but it'll take a long time to figure it out. So you get the picture there that there's a lot of, these are valuable systems, underappreciated, little understood, and things are changing very rapidly. And there are a lot of connections between things in these systems. And I showed this, I'm just going to go through this example. This is, I guess, what led me to come here in a way, this particular example. Example of interconnectivity between different ecological elements within a watershed. So this is the Riley Creek watershed, which is just west of Minneapolis-St. Paul. It drains into the Minnesota River, which goes to Mississippi, and 2,000 miles later ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. These lakes are all connected, and it's filled with this particular species of invasive common carp, which came, and I started asking about 10 years ago, what's the idea? People hate these fish. I don't know if you're familiar. At least people love them in Europe. They're the #1 game species in the UK. This is often the case with invasive species. But in North America, it doesn't seem to matter whether you're Mexican, American, or Canadian. People dislike them, but I think they're pretty interesting. And they actually hail originally from the Ponto-Caspian area, from the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, large, to get like this kind of size. They can actually tolerate pretty good salinities pretty well. And they were cutting the chase, basically. They were introduced to North America in the late 1870s and 80s as a consequence of these acclimatization societies. And as I know is often the case, within a couple years of them coming to the U.S., somebody in Ottawa thought it was a pretty good idea, and they were brought over to eastern Canada too. I don't know quite how that spun out in Canada, but you have them all over eastern Canada and central Canada. They were brought over on purpose because, well, as far as we can tell, it just seemed to be a complaint of recent immigrants from Eastern Europe who missed their carp and didn't like native fish, didn't know what they were. They thought this would be an improvement. You know, that's what people did back then. I guess people still do it now. So they brought these carp over, and it's an interesting story. Took a couple times. Eventually they ended up with a group from Germany of 345 adult carp. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., they were actually raised in the reflecting pools in Washington, D.C. for about 20 years and transported across the United States. And some did go up to Ottawa. And I suppose they were probably welcomed. I know in Minneapolis, St. Paul, when they arrived in the local railroad station, they were greeted by armed guards and treated very carefully and delicately, and purposely introduced the lakes with great care. And that was one of the biggest mistakes that's ever been made, probably, in terms of invasive species. They spread very quickly. They now cover, they actually are in every continent except Africa. There are common carp problems in Australia, South Africa, all around the world. And there are a few things I just wanted to say about them when we started. They're quite interesting. We knew that the adults migrate to spawn every year, even though they live in lakes. This is probably something left from the original behaviors, because they would go from the Caspian Sea up the Volga and Danube rivers to spawn in wetlands. Not much is known about that. In fact, they're endangered in those systems now, probably because of the damming. And they carry 1 to 3 million eggs. The common carp do quite a few. They migrate every year. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. They grow very rapidly, so within a year they're about that kind of size, which puts them outside the gape of most predators. They're extremely long-lived. A lot of freshwater fish are. I think people are often surprised to hear this. Turns out the common carp can live up to about 60, we've aged them as 65 years. This is Benson, the carp from the London Times, the only carp that ever made got an obituary in the London Times, who died from a surfeit of tiger nuts, if I remember right, a much-loved fish in the UK. But they live to be very old and large, and they spawn every year. And they have this extraordinary ability of actually feeding in the bottom And the way they do this, if any of you are familiar with common carp, people think, oh, they're bottom feeders of these crude, disgusting animals. It's actually a highly sophisticated system. The neurobiology has all been worked out. The entire palate and roof of their mouth and their gill arches are highly innervated, and there are millions of taste buds. And they can dig things up and locate, and then things down to a millimeter in size, little insects and eggs and things like that, and they can capture them and then swallow them and sort them out. So it's a very complicated and sophisticated behavior. I work with Asian carps now. You may have heard of the Asian carps from Asia. They have kind of the same kind of feeding mode, just as sophisticated, frankly, as any oceanic filter feeder. They filter feed in the Mississippi River, pulling out the plankton with very complicated taste and olfactory systems. Anyway, these guys are great feeders. And what they do when they become abundant, hopefully this will work here, they feed in the bottom like this. North America, for some reason, the fishes, freshwater fishes, did not develop a benthivorous life history like this. But when you have shallow lakes and waters and things are feeding in the bottom and actually actively digging down to a depth of about 10 to 15 centimeters, digging and pulling out these tiny particles, what it does is, in these systems that are so dynamic, is it totally flips them upside down, and this is known as an ecosystem engineer. People make careers of this. So they actually, by filtering out the water and increasing turbidity and ripping out the plants in particular, they turn lakes that are clear into, they turn the whole ecosystem inside out. All the food webs reverse, everything changes, and it reaches sort of a semi-permanent state. And what you see here is Lake Windra, if you've ever been to Madison, Wisconsin, which is a typical shallow lake. They put an exclusion, they put a big wall out there to exclude the carp. And you can see just by excluding them, the water totally clarified. It's a totally different food web and ecosystem. Away from carp is inside of that. So they've done this now to hundreds of, probably millions of hectares of wetlands and shallow lakes across North America, and you'd think this would have a big effect. And it seems to, and people, they were introduced in 1877, and by about 1905, people had decided this looked pretty bad, and no one wanted to eat them anymore. So both, all the government started running backwards, and the story was they started efforts to remove them. There is no, I know there are aquatic invasive species problems in the marine systems, but it's nothing like this. These are systems that are literally turned inside out in perpetuity until something is done. And it's a dramatic thing because they're so simple, and you get shading, you can see the plants would change, the nutrients would change, the food webs, the zooplankton, everything changes. It's like it's reinvented. Anyway, so people have been ever since trying to poison systems with plant root extract, rotenone, entire systems, entire lakes, 100,000 acre lakes, poisoned. Start all over again. And it's amazing, I think, from an applied ecological perspective to look at that. Trying to fish them out, trying to draw them down. And my lab got interested in figuring out, so, you know, why are there so many carp? Because we realized that no one had done much fishery biology on them, really. It's just pretty basic. And we just sort of wondered how many were there. No one had even any population estimates. We thought, well, maybe if we figured out how many there were, maybe we could sort of figure out what's driving the population dynamics. And then we could figure out, like, what's the relationship with water quality and clarity and ecosystem function. So I'm just going to show you this. And this is an example of what really drove it home to me was how complicated and interwoven and interconnected all these systems are. And of course, all these lakes are interconnected. So we asked how many there were. And we did something that's very rarely done in freshwater systems. We hired commercial fishermen, we seined entire lakes. And we did mark recapture estimates to figure out how many there were. This was kind of interesting. So we would do this, and people would come running out and say, oh, Dr. Sorensen, thank God for you, you're removing the carp. I said, wait a minute, I got to mark them and put them back. And they said, oh no! I said, but I promise I'll come back and get them. And I always came back and got them. But initially there was you know, you got to put them out and get them back. So we figured out anyway. We got population estimates. The details of this probably aren't terribly important, but I can tell you that the biomass is as high as most marine systems, hundreds of kilograms per hectare of fish, and they were probably 2/3 the total biomass of these lakes, and they've been like that for 100 years, living in there, happily eating the bottom, reproducing every year, migrating the sides, and at least we knew how many we had at that point. So that was kind of interesting. And then we kind of got interested in, some of you have heard this story, so just like, where were they? I mean, I didn't quite know why, but I just felt we had to know where they were to kind of figure out how many there were. And we started radio tracking, and we found something really interesting which we never expected. And this is these 3 lakes are interconnected with very small ephemeral connections that only flood once a year. And most people living in the lakes don't even know those connections are there. And they eventually run down to the Minnesota River and then the Mississippi River. But they are interconnected and they flow between each other, very ephemeral. This is typical for a lot of freshwater systems. Really complicated, actually. The devil's in the details. This is hard. And we didn't know they were there either, but we marked all these fish, and all those colors are different radio tagged fish. And what we found was, to our amazement, in the spring, 1/3 of these fish were leaving these lakes going to a little marsh just to one side. We had no idea they did this. People knew they moved, but they didn't know what it was about. It seemed to be a random movement. And like I said, most people living in this lake had no idea that there was a connection to the other lake. Some people didn't even know there was a lake, you know, a kilometer away, frankly. They were just happy in their lake. That's the way people are. But we found the carp were finding this connection for us. And they were all moving to that little, you see where the mixed dots are in the middle there? And then what was really interesting, and we've elaborated much more on this, is they all came back. They're like salmon. So they would go there and they'd come back every year. Exactly the same way. And this is a small scale of what a salmon does, but still pretty complicated because there are numerous tributaries and they're quite small. And since then, I can tell you, we've tracked them up a series of 10 or 12 lakes. And they home just like with as much precision as a salmon within 100 meters or so, and they all come back. And they do this 50, 60 years, and what's really amazing, frankly, it's a strategy known as partial migration, and if you block them, they don't sit there and die. They actually are smart enough to turn around, go spawn somewhere else, and they try it again next year. So they're pretty clever. They figure it all out. They know what they're doing, and they know where they're at, and they're survivors. And my God, they fooled everybody in that area of the world for a long time. And so we found them. We also found that they would aggregate every winter. So right now in Minnesota, they're forming little carp parties in certain portions of this lake. They get together and they start feeding, and that was important too. And then the other thing we looked at was we wondered how old they were. We really didn't know. I have classical training in fisheries biology, and I never really used it. I thought, well, we should at least figure out what they were. So we took out their ear bones, their otoliths, and we sectioned them. And this is what we found. And this is, you know, was, I thought, pretty interesting, because up to this point, everyone thought, well, there are a million of them, they have millions of eggs, this goes on, you'll never do anything about it. But when we aged them, we found that there was definite evidence, there was clear evidence of age classes. You can see there were 3 age classes in this lake. Very clear. And one year was much bigger than the others, 1991. Most years, they reproduce every year, as far as we can tell, releasing billions. I can tell you, we knew there was 6,000 carp in Lake Riley, 1 million eggs each. That's, half of them are females. That's several billion eggs a year. No survival. It's really got very interesting, the recruitment patterns. But because they do this every year, and then we started wondering what's driving the recruitment. And I'll just show you here, we happen to have good data here. And what it was it was correlated with really cold winters like this one. And in lakes, you often get a natural phenomenon known as winter kill. I know you can get this in estuaries too, in tropical climates. In freshwater lakes, this is real common. You get heavy snow and ice, it seals off the lake, oxygen runs out, it dies. Everything dies, and it goes through a natural cycle. And we found that the carp were exploiting these cycles, and actually when the adjoining lakes winter killed, they would pull off a great year class. So the question is then, what the heck is going on there? At first it seemed really counterintuitive, right? It particularly was happening, if you notice, in the shallow wetlands where they were moving out to. So what do you think was happening? Some of you have heard this story, but it was really interesting. Basically, what was happening was when these marshes die off, this is a winter kill. This is happening in large areas of central our freshwaters right now. Think of the nutrients that are released and the cycles that are involved with this and the complexity of it. I mean, it's really very hard to study, frankly. It's a main driver in most freshwater systems. All the predators die, or almost all. Well, if the carp migrate up those things every spring and there are no predators there, then their eggs are going to survive, right? And that's exactly what was happening. And that's the strategy they have evolved over the last few million years, apparently in the Volga and Caspian Sea, is to find these predator-less systems that are maybe prone to winter kill or summer kill or something like that. They go up there, they release their eggs, and then they can pull off a year class like that. And then they come back down and they find their way and they trick everybody. And they do this, they live 40, 50 years old. Now to test this, I'll just show you really quickly. We did another set of experiments in which we looked at the presence of predators in lakes to see if they would eat the carp eggs. And what we found was the little predatory fish were actually following the carps around, eating the eggs as they were released. And that's the bottom figure you see there is number of eggs in micropredators, these little sunfish, these little native fish, in their stomachs, and the number of eggs that were being released. And it's an exact correlation. So we hypothesized, I'll tell you where I'm coming, you'll see in a minute, I'm just hang in there, that basically these are a migratory species that nobody had realized was migratory, actually partially migratory. They're homing back to certain areas, usually exploiting areas that are a poor habitat for spawning, where the young can survive, turn them into a nursery. A lot of marine fish do these kinds of things, and coming back to the main lakes every year. And that was what was driving the invasive properties of common carp in our area of the world. So the next step was, well, this is interesting, so this means that maybe we can do something about it too. Because I can tell you that marsh used to be the site of an old dairy farm, and it was filled with nutrients. So it had severe water quality problems. And everyone neglected it. No one wanted to live there. That was just a god-awful place. And everyone ignored it. Yet all these waters are connected, and the carp knew about it. So we wondered if we could do a couple things. We started, I'll just skip through this. So before we started, Lake Susan had about 3/4 of the biomass was common carp there, and it looked like that. It was totally opaque. And this is a nice area of the world. There are $1 million houses on that lake. And people can't go swimming in there because it's all green, it's all scummy, it's filled with plants. Fish populations aren't good, water clarity is clear. So we said, well, you know, maybe then, rather than poisoning it, maybe we can do two things. One was maybe we thought we could find these fish in the winter. It's called Judas fish technique, because they aggregate, and we can find where they centralize their activity and then catch them all at once. Wait till they get together, and then we did that. And actually, we waited to the middle of winter. You can see that's ice fishing in Minnesota. There's commercial ice fishing. They cut through the ice. They have little robotic things, and they pull the nets under the ice, actually, and they catch the fish, and they bring them in. That's what's going on there. And because we pulled the net like that, because we saw the fish aggregating, we were able to remove 80% of them in one day. And then we did one other thing, and that was because of this marsh, where they were all spawning at the top, we aerated that marsh because it had poor water quality to encourage the micropredator fish to come back, and then blocked it at the same time. And by systematically netting, removing the adults, and preventing successful recruitment in that place, we basically drove it down with use of any poisons whatsoever. And this was like a huge success, and I've still got to write it up, actually. And that was all pretty good, and people were thinking this was wonderful, and we were kind of heroes. And but then what happened, this is the point of the whole thing, was the carp were gone. Well, as you'd expect, all the plants, the aquatic plants, came back. And that wasn't a bad thing, because that increases habitat for native fish, because it was just a muddy bowl before this. The plants came back, but the problem was Very soon thereafter, all the invasive plants came back immediately, and they choked out the native plants. So the carp were suppressing all plants, the native fish plants came back, and then the invasive plants came just on top of that. And then this is a little bit complicated, but we saw that water quality improved because there was less phosphorus being released by the carp. But what happened was, we found that every summer, the phosphorus, see, there's very complex, shallow waters like in lakes, they're really closely connected with the sediments below them in a way that you don't see in marine systems. And they go anoxic. And when they go anoxic, the whole biogeochemistry of those sediments change and they start releasing phosphorus again. And that's exactly what happened. So the lakes cleared up, and then they got bad again because of the dairy farm that had been there 100 years before and had put the phosphorus in there. It was, where's this coming from? It's like, that came from your grandfather. I'm sorry, he didn't know what he was doing, but that's literally the case. And the fisheries improved quite a bit. That's what you see there. And then within a year, we have such heavy fishing industry people, around, 1.5 million recreational fishermen. They all talk to each other on the phone. The fishery it jumped up. We went up to 15. We would do a creel census. 15,000 bluegill, like the biggest fish in the entire metro area. But within a year, the fishermen had found it and they'd fished it down 50%. One winter they did that. Okay, 200-acre lake. So, what do you got here? Okay, this is where I said, oh my goodness, because I've been focusing on invasive species, think it's going to do all this good. It's like that's not enough, You've got water quality, you've got temperature cycling now. All this winter kill phenomena is going to change with climate change. The predatory fish, the species composition. It's not enough to save these freshwater. It can't be. We've got to deal with it all. They're forced to deal with it all. And of course, that's not what people want to hear. That's not what people are doing. But that's kind of why I'm here, because I teach marine biology, and I know about these marine protected areas. And what's a marine protected area do? It tries to at least address things holistically, everything. The overfishing, not so much nutrients, that's not usually a big deal in salt water, but overfishing certainly is, pollution is, global warming is, but it's even worse and more complicated, more tied together in freshwater. And I just told you, they may not be quite as important to world production fisheries as marine systems, but they're pretty darn important. And so the question is, how do you deal with it all? And that's kind of why I sort of came here, because I think there's only two options, and I can tell you what the state of Minnesota is doing. I think it's basically happened in Canada. People are just throwing millions of dollars at the technology now. They're stocking fish. They're developing new phosphorus removal programs. They're developing new poisons to kill invasive plants. We spend $10 million a year inspecting boats to stop invasive species from coming in. There's no way. I mean, fortunately, I'm at the tail end of my career, so I can be honest about this. But when I go down to the State House, and I go down and talk to politicians and say, don't waste your money on that. They don't like to hear it very much. I'm not always very popular. But it's true, it's not enough. You've got to do something different. You've got to treat the system for what it is. It's holistic and it's interconnected. So that means you need some, and I think I know less about rivers. Rivers seem to be a whole other thing. I'm learning that now as working in Mississippi with Asian carp, at least temperate rivers, very complicated nutrient cycles in rivers. People don't even know them, understand them. So you need some kind of targeted protection. So, of course, I don't know how many there are in varying numbers. It seems somewhere between 10 and 15,000 how you count them marine protected areas. It seems to be. As you know, it's 7 different types. There's not one in freshwater. Not one. So it's like, well, maybe this idea is at least worth looking at. So that's what I thought. So the problem is, as soon as you bring it up, it's like, well, what would they look like? Obviously it's really different than a coral reef or something. What difference might they make? I mean, this is what happens when I give this talk at home. It's like, what are the costs versus the benefits? How large do they have to be, after all? I mean, I can't. You expect me to leave my house and move somewhere else? How much surrounding area has to be saved? There are all these issues. And some of the marine stuff applies really readily, but this watershed thing is quite different with freshwater. How pristine does the system have to be? I mean, 40% of all lakes in Minnesota, and I suspect southern Ontario is pretty similar, because it's pretty similar types of lakes and population density, are already impacted. Is it too late already for those? I don't know. Anyway, there are all these issues. What about climate change? What about... So I just started thinking, it's like, well, I'll come here, because after all, marine protected areas, when you look through the literature going back, they same questions. People initially thought, well, it can't work, there's this, there's that, it's too small, it's too big, you can't police it, whatever it might be, right? It still goes on, but it's somehow the field, I don't get it, but the field is moving forward. And so that's why I'm here, and I'm actually really interested in collaboration and ideas, because this is more than a one-man job, that's for sure, especially if somebody not starting a career. So I've been thinking there'd be two ways, and I'll just tell you briefly in the next 5 minutes what I'm thinking of. One is trying to quantify the status of global freshwater fisheries. It's really never been done. There's a partial job in riverine fisheries, but it really hasn't been done. Like, so where are we exactly in this thing? How many fish are there? What are the trends in freshwater? It's going to be much messier and more complicated, but unless you know where you're at, like, you can't answer those other questions, I think. You need to know what baseline is. And then I was thinking I would try and perform a critical evaluation of the concept, particularly for North American freshwater fisheries. So I'll tell you about number one, which is what I'd be working with Rashid and Daniel Pauly and that group here, and that is quantifying the status of global freshwater fisheries. Because only by knowing the status can you figure out what the base is. And so we're going to start, and I leave the Philippines next week, a country-by-country survey, the FAO data, to try and quantify it. Look at what he's done for the last 20 years, I guess. Try and start anyway. I mean, just start. Fish biomass, fish size, socioeconomic value, those kinds of things. And once we have that, maybe we can look at some of these things, because stocking is a very significant, like stocking, for instance, is a big deal. Minnesota stocks tens of millions of fish a year without even knowing if they have any effect, honestly. It's a serious confound on the data. So we'd like to see how that impacts globally freshwater fisheries. Is it paying off? What's the role of overfishing in development? There are a million questions. It's really going to be determined what the nature of the data looks like, honestly, which I won't know for a few months. And then once we get to the end of that, we might ask how freshwater protected areas might enhance their value. And what we know, and I think I'm going to be shocked at the state of the data. I think we're going to have almost no idea what's going on globally with freshwater fish, unfortunately. But I'm going to try. I've got that opportunity to at least try. Start it, maybe. But we'll see. As I think really the anchor point of most marine fisheries really has been the commercial trawls and so forth. And then second off, I wanted to look at focus on North America, just because we've got to start somewhere, and this seems a little more tractable. And I know that the provincial guys are all at this meeting, so I'm going to talk with them next week about it. But anyone here who's interested too, the idea would be to look at the key threats, which I see to freshwater fisheries. I mean, some of these are exactly the same as marines. Climate change, but worse in freshwater. Water quality, but worse in freshwater. Habitat loss, probably pretty much the same. Overfishing, probably worse in freshwater. Water quantity, I hadn't talked about that. We're running out of fresh water. A lot of it's going the other. There's a water quantity problem in freshwater, right? So with climate change, a lot of seas are drying up, and dams are getting diverted. There's a loss. So that's an issue we have to talk about. Loss of connectivity, and then aquatic invasive species. Just give me 1 second. And then we want to review the relative, and then I'll just skip to it, create some kind of model, I thought, that would look at all these different variables for a couple different fisheries. Maybe salmon fisheries out here, and maybe lake fisheries like I see in Minnesota and that exist in Ontario. And you could this is sort of hypothetical, but the idea would be you could forecast the effects of changing these different variables in some kind of hypothetical protected area to see what difference it made, for instance, if fishing pressure was cut in half, or there was no take, or you expanded the watershed protection so that there were fewer nutrients coming in. It would have to be very hypothetical, but at least it might get it started. That would be my idea. So we've got some numbers to play around with, something to think about, and we'll see what happens. I mean, it may be this is a totally impractical idea. There are a lot of skeptics out there just say, well, it just can't work. But then, you know, I know that was exactly how marine people were very skeptical about it initially. Still are, many people. But, you know, it just happened. So I'd like to do that. So I guess I'm running out of time, but if anyone's interested, I'm very willing. I would welcome the chance to talk with you more about this before or later. So thank you very much.